Imagine you're a child, just 6 or 7 years old, going about your day in the safety of your home. A home that's supposed to be a place of warmth, comfort, and protection. But what happens when that sense of safety is ripped away? What happens when something, or someone, unseen reaches out from the past, pulling you into a nightmare you never saw coming? Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the lines between reality and the supernatural blur. Today's story isn't just another ghost tale. It's a chilling, real-life account of a young girl who saw something no child should ever see. What she witnessed would change her forever, and by the end of this video, it might just change you too. The story you're about to hear is about an innocent girl who encountered a presence from beyond the grave, her own grandfather. A man she never knew. A man who had died long before she was born, but whose shadow still loomed large over the house he helped build. A single, ordinary moment turned into a horrifying experience that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Are you ready for this unsettling journey? Make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Stories if you dare, and share it with those who love true stories that chill you to the bone. Because this one is going to leave you questioning what's real and what might be waiting just out of sight. This house, which once bustled with life and warmth, had grown eerily quiet over the years. Each corner seemed to harbor shadows that clung to the walls, stretching with the setting sun as if alive. The second-floor bathroom had become a place the young girl felt uneasy in, though she couldn't explain why. The window facing the staircase was meant to offer light and visibility, but instead, it seemed to frame something darker, something waiting in the shadows below. Every time she passed by the stairs, she felt an inexplicable shiver crawl up her spine, as if eyes, unseen yet ever present, were watching her from the depths. The staircase itself felt like a portal to something ominous, descending into the unknown with each creak underfoot. During the day, it seemed relatively harmless, though always cloaked in gloom. But at night, when the house was bathed in moonlight, the stairs transformed into something much more sinister. The way the shadows danced along the banisters gave the impression of figures, dark and ghostly, slowly moving up and down the steps. Even the air seemed heavier near the staircase, colder, as if the warmth of the living world couldn't quite reach that part of the house. No one in the family spoke of it, but they all felt it, the sensation that something or someone lingered there. And then there was the silence. It wasn't the comforting silence of a home at peace, but an oppressive stillness that weighed on the girl's chest, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Every so often, a faint creak would break the quiet, coming from the stairs or perhaps the attic above, sounds easily explained by old wood settling, or so her mother would say. But deep down, the girl knew better. The house wasn't simply old. It was alive with memories, and not all of them belonged to the living. On that particular day, as she innocently went about her business, something shifted. The light in the house seemed to dim, despite it being midday. The girl, sitting in the bathroom with the door ajar, could see the stairs through the window. The view, which should have been mundane, suddenly felt like a stage for something terrifying. She didn't know why, but her eyes were drawn to the staircase, and as she gazed down, the familiar creaks and groans began to morph into something more. Footsteps, soft at first, but unmistakable. Her heart pounded as the rhythmic sound of steps grew louder, closer, ascending one by one. She strained to see who it could be, but the angle of the window revealed nothing until the figure came into view. It was a man, bald and dressed in an old-fashioned suit, climbing the stairs with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't looking at her, but his presence was suffocating. There was something unnatural in the way he moved, something wrong. He didn't belong. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She knew, deep down, this wasn't someone from the living world. The figure's pale face, his sunken eyes, and the old suit that seemed to hang loosely on him. It was like looking at a faded photograph, one that shouldn't have come to life. He resembled no one she had ever seen, and yet there was an eerie familiarity to him. Her blood turned cold as she watched him ascend the final steps. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The girl screamed, a sound filled with primal fear, breaking the thick silence of the house. In that moment, she realized what she had seen wasn't just a stranger. It was something far more terrifying, a specter from the past, drawn back to the home he had once known, walking the stairs he had helped build. Her mind raced as her mother rushed to her side, but no explanation could quell the terror that now gripped her heart. This house, once her sanctuary, was now a place of unspeakable mystery and fear. It started as a normal day, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to foreshadow the horror about to unfold. The house was quiet, but not in a comforting way. There was something different in the air that day, something heavy, almost suffocating. The girl, unaware of what was lurking just beyond her senses, went about her usual routine. She felt a strange unease, but dismissed it as her imagination. After all, what harm could come from an old house she had lived in for so many years? But deep down, she knew that something was not right. As she sat in the bathroom, the door slightly ajar, she became hyper-aware of every sound. The soft creaking of the house, the occasional rustling of leaves outside, even her own breath seemed louder than usual. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, as if the warmth of the afternoon sun had been sucked away by an unseen force. She glanced nervously towards a window that faced the stairs. That's when she heard it, the first sign that something was terribly wrong. A soft, almost imperceptible footstep, followed by another coming from the staircase. It was slow, deliberate, and unnervingly measured. At first, she thought it must be one of her parents, but the rhythm of the steps fell wrong, like someone was taking their time, climbing the stairs with a purpose she couldn't understand. Her heartbeat quickened, and an icy knot formed in her stomach. She listened closely, straining to catch every sound. The steps were coming closer, but no voice called out, no familiar presence approached. Just the eerie sound of shoes dragging against the wooden stairs, one slow step at a time. Her hands began to tremble, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The house felt alive, watching her, waiting. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was all in her head. Maybe it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on her ears. But then came the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It was as if someone, or something, was standing just out of sight, their gaze boring into her through the walls. She turned her head slowly toward the window, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced, telling her not to look, that whatever was coming up those stairs was not meant to be seen. But curiosity, laced with dread, compelled her to glance. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, just beyond the threshold of the final step, was the figure of a man, bald, dressed in an old suit, his form hazy and pale, as though he were a faded photograph brought to life. His features were sharp yet hollow, his expression distant, as if he existed in a world beyond hers. He didn't look directly at her, but the menace in his presence was palpable. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if time itself bent around him. For a fleeting second, she thought she recognized him, but the memory was distant, like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. The room seemed to freeze. The girl's body locked in place as the man neared the top of the stairs, his figure becoming clearer, more real with each step. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she feared it would give her away, but he never acknowledged her presence. He continued to climb, nearing the top of the staircase. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, dissolving into the shadows like smoke dissipating into thin air. She let out a scream, sharp, terrified, the kind that comes from deep within, fueled by primal fear. Her voice shattered the eerie silence of the house, echoing through the halls. In a heartbeat, her mother rushed into the room, panic in her eyes, demanding to know what had happened. The girl, still frozen with fear, could only point towards the stairs, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what she had just seen. Her mother looked at her, then at the empty staircase, and for a brief moment, the room fell into an even deeper silence. What the girl had just witnessed defied explanation, leaving her mother to wonder if something far more sinister had taken hold of their home. And that's when her mother, pale-faced, quietly retrieved an old wedding album from a forgotten drawer, an album the girl had never seen before. Inside were photos of her mother's first marriage, long before she was born. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned the pages, dread building with every flip of the album. Finally, there he was, the man she had seen on the stairs, but dressed in the same old suit. The man from her mother's past. The man who had died years before she had even been born. Her grandfather. The same suit he had been buried in. The girl's eyes widened as the realization settled in, a cold chill crawling down her spine. What she had seen wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of her imagination. It was something far worse, an encounter with a presence that should not have been there. The girl sat frozen in the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest as the terrifying image of the man on the stairs burned in her mind. Fear clutched at her, wrapping cold fingers around her throat. The logical part of her wanted to believe it was all a bad dream, a trick of her young mind, but deep down, she knew what she had seen. It wasn't her imagination, it was real, and it was standing just steps away from her only moments ago. Now, as her mother showed her the album, confirming that the man was her long-dead grandfather, a sickening realization settled over her. The past was not as distant as she had once thought. Something unnatural had bridged the gap between life and death, and it had found its way back into their home. The girl's mother, pale and shaken, tried to comfort her, insisting that it was just a coincidence, that old houses often had creaks and groans, and sometimes our eyes play tricks on us. But the girl could see the fear in her mother's eyes too, that slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her attempts at calm. They both knew that something was wrong, deeply and inexplicably wrong. The girl was faced with a choice. Should she try to forget about the strange figure and move on, as if nothing had happened, or should she confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be? Night fell, and the house, now cloaked in darkness, seemed to breathe around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in the shadows. The stairs, once just a mundane part of her home, now felt like the gateway to something sinister. Each time she passed by, she expected to see him again, that same man in the suit, watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The house had always been familiar, but now it felt like a stranger, its every corner hiding secrets. The girl's curiosity began to gnaw at her, battling the overwhelming fear that gripped her. Part of her wanted to know more. What had she really seen? Was it her grandfather's spirit, trapped in the house he had built? Or was it something far worse, masquerading as a familiar face to lure her into its grasp? But every time she considered investigating further, a deeper dread took hold, a primal instinct telling her to stay away, to leave whatever lurked in the shadows undisturbed. As the days passed, the tension grew unbearable. The girl could no longer ignore the creeping sense of dread that filled the house. The footsteps on the stairs continued, always at the same slow, deliberate pace, but now they happened more frequently, always in the dead of night when the house was at its quietest. Sometimes she would hear them just as she was drifting off to sleep, jolting her awake with her heart racing. Other times, she would hear them in the early morning, before anyone else in the house had stirred. And every time, they filled her with the same cold terror. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she made her decision. She had to confront whatever was haunting her. She had to know if it was really her grandfather, or if something more sinister was hiding behind that familiar face. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and trembling hands, she crept out of bed and made her way towards the staircase. The house was deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every sound seem louder, more threatening. Her breath was shallow, and her pulse pounded in her ears as she approached the top of the stairs, the place where she had first seen him. As she stood there, staring down into the dark abyss below, she felt that familiar chill run down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to go to the safety of her bed and pretend none of this was happening. But she couldn't. She had to know the truth. Her hands shook as she slowly descended the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder with every step, as though she were walking deeper into some otherworldly realm where the laws of reality no longer applied. Halfway down, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind her. She froze, her heart stopping for a split second. Slowly, she turned her head, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. And there he was, the man in the suit, standing just a few steps behind her, his hollow eyes staring straight ahead, as if he didn't even notice her. But the most terrifying thing was his expression, blank, lifeless, as if he were nothing more than an empty shell, a shadow of someone who once was. The air around him was ice cold, and for a moment, the girl couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, torn between the urge to flee and the gnawing need to understand what was happening. She had wanted answers, but now that she stood face to face with this figure, she realized that some things were never meant to be understood. Her decision had brought her here, into the heart of the mystery, and now there was no turning back. The figure took another step towards her, slow and deliberate, the sound of his footfall echoing like a death knell in the silence. She had to make her choice, run, or face whatever nightmare was staring back at her. The girl sat frozen in the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest as the terrifying image of the man on the stairs burned in her mind. Fear clutched at her, wrapping cold fingers around her throat. The logical part of her wanted to believe it was all a bad dream, a trick of her young mind, but deep down, she knew what she had seen. It wasn't her imagination, it was real, and was standing just steps away from her only moments ago. Now, as her mother showed her the album, confirming that the man was her long-dead grandfather, a sickening realization settled over her. The past was not as distant as she had once thought. Something unnatural had bridged the gap between life and death, and it had found its way back into their home. The girl's mother, pale and shaken, tried to comfort her, insisting that it was just a coincidence, that old houses often had creaks and groans, and sometimes our eyes play tricks on us. But the girl could see the fear in her mother's eyes too, that slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her attempts at calm. They both knew that something was wrong, deeply and inexplicably wrong. The girl was faced with a choice. Should she try to forget about the strange figure and move on, as if nothing had happened, or should she confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be? Night fell, and the house, now cloaked in darkness, seemed to breathe around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows, made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in the shadows. The stairs, once just a mundane part of her home, now felt like the gateway to something sinister. Each time she passed by, she expected to see him again, that same man in the suit, watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The house had always been familiar, but now it felt like a stranger, its every corner hiding secrets. The girl's curiosity began to gnaw at her, battling the overwhelming fear that gripped her. Part of her wanted to know more. What had she really seen? Was it her grandfather's spirit, trapped in the house he had built? Or was it something far worse, masquerading as a familiar face to lure her into its grasp? But every time she considered investigating further, a deeper dread took hold, a primal instinct telling her to stay away, to leave whatever lurked in the shadows undisturbed. As the days passed, the tension grew unbearable. The girl could no longer ignore the creeping sense of dread that filled the house. The footsteps on the stairs continued, always at the same slow, deliberate pace, but now they happened more frequently, always in the dead of night when the house was at its quietest. Sometimes she would hear them just as she was drifting off to sleep, jolting her awake with her heart racing. Other times, she would hear them in the early morning, before anyone else in the house had stirred. And every time, they filled her with the same cold terror. One night, unable to bear it any longer, she made her decision. She had to confront whatever was haunting her. She had to know if it was really her grandfather, or if something more sinister was hiding behind that familiar face. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and trembling hands, she crept out of bed and made her way towards the staircase. The house was deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every sound seem louder, more threatening. Her breath was shallow, and her pulse pounded in her ears as she approached the top of the stairs, the place where she had first seen him. As she stood there, staring down into the dark abyss below, she felt that familiar chill run down her spine. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to go to the safety of her bed and pretend none of this was happening. But she couldn't. She had to know the truth. Her hands shook as she slowly descended the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder with every step, as though she were walking deeper into some otherworldly realm where the laws of reality no longer applied. Halfway down, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind her. She froze, her heart stopping for a split second. Slowly, she turned her head, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. And there he was, the man in the suit, standing just a few steps behind her, his hollow eyes staring straight ahead, as if he didn't even notice her. But the most terrifying thing was his expression, blank, lifeless, as if he were nothing more than an empty shell, a shadow of someone who once was. The air around him was ice cold, and for a moment, the girl couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, torn between the urge to flee and the gnawing need to understand what was happening. She had wanted answers, but now that she stood face to face with this figure, she realized that some things were never meant to be understood. Her decision had brought her here, into the heart of the mystery, and now there was no turning back. The figure took another step towards her, slow and deliberate, the sound of his footfall echoing like a death knell in the silence. She had to make her choice, run, or face whatever nightmare was staring back at her. The moment the girl decided to confront what she had seen, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift. It was as if the very air had grown heavier, suffocating her with an invisible weight. Each step she took toward the staircase felt like a step closer to something unknowable, something that shouldn't exist in the world of the living. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound loud in her ears as she descended the creaky wooden stairs, flashlight trembling in her hand. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional soft groan of the floorboards underfoot, a sound that seemed almost alive in the darkness. She reached the middle of the staircase, where the shadows deepened, almost swallowing the light from her flashlight. Then she felt it, a presence, not something she could see, but something that sent a wave of cold terror through her body. The air around her grew icy, and she instinctively knew she wasn't alone. Her breath caught in her throat as she directed the beam of light towards the bottom of the stairs. That's when she saw him again, the man, the same bald man in the dark suit she had seen days before. But this time, he wasn't just a fleeting figure in the corner of her eye. He was standing there, fully formed, his gaunt face pale, as if drained of life. His eyes, cold, hollow, seemed to pierce through her, as if he were looking straight into her soul. The fear was immediate and primal, her body locking in place as if paralyzed by his gaze. He stood at the base of the stairs, motionless, watching her with an expression that was devoid of emotion, yet filled with an otherworldly presence. The girl's blood ran cold as she tried to understand what she was seeing. This wasn't just a ghost, a harmless apparition wandering the halls of a haunted house. There was something far more sinister about this figure, something that felt deeply wrong. He didn't blink, didn't move. His presence wasn't just frightening, it was suffocating, like the darkness itself had taken form to confront her. The silence of the house only made it worse. There was no sound except her own rapid breathing and the pounding of her heart, but the tension in the air was unbearable, as if the house was waiting for something to happen. Summoning all the courage she could, she tried to speak, her voice trembling as she called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" But the figure didn't respond. Instead, he began to move slowly, deliberately, taking one step at a time up the stairs. His movements were unnatural, stiff, as though he were a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Each step echoed in the silence, a sound that sent chills down her spine. She tried to back away, but her feet felt glued to the spot, her body betraying her in the face of pure terror. The closer he got, the more the air around her seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping so rapidly that she could see her breath misting in the dim light. The shadows around the man seemed to warp and twist, bending unnaturally, as if they were alive, responding to his presence. It was as if he were drawing the darkness toward him, consuming the very light in the room. She felt the overwhelming urge to flee, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped, frozen in fear, as the man continued his slow ascent toward her. As he reached the middle of a staircase, just a few steps below her, she could see him clearly now. His face was expressionless, but there was something deeply unsettling about his eyes. Empty, like dark pools that reflected nothing back. His suit was old-fashioned, the kind of formal wear that seemed out of place in the present day. But what horrified her the most was the realization that this was the same suit she had seen in the photo album. Her grandfather's suit, the one he had been buried in. It was impossible, yet there he was, standing before her. She had never met him, never even seen him in life, and yet she was now face to face with his spectral form. But this wasn't a warm, loving reunion with a lost family member. The man who stood before her was not her grandfather, not anymore. Whatever he had once been, it was long gone. What remained was something darker, something that had taken his form to communicate with her, to confront her in this moment of terror. The girl's mind raced. Why was this happening? What did this spirit want from her? As she stood there, trembling, she realized that this wasn't just a random haunting. This figure had purpose. There was a reason he had appeared, and that reason terrified her. The man, or whatever he had become, was tied to the house, to the very foundation of the home her grandfather had built. His presence was a manifestation of something unfinished, something unresolved, and now she was caught in the middle of it. With one final, slow step, the figure stopped just inches from her. The air between them crackled with cold energy, her skin prickling with goosebumps. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even though his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. In that moment, she understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, and her grandfather's spirit had been trapped in it, bound to the place he had once helped build. But why? And why now, after all these years? The confrontation was more than just a ghostly encounter. It was a silent plea for help, a terrifying connection between the living and the dead. As the girl stood on the stairs, staring into the eyes of the man she had never met, she realized that the spirit wasn't just there to scare her. It was there to show her something that only she could uncover. But the fear, the overwhelming dread that coursed through her, made it almost impossible to think clearly. In the silence, the figure began to fade, his form dissolving into the darkness, like smoke dispersing in the wind. The temperature in the room began to rise again, and the heavy weight in the air lifted, leaving the girl standing alone on the stairs, her flashlight flickering in her hand. The confrontation was over, but the terror wasn't. The man had disappeared, but his presence still lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. She knew he would return. The house was still holding on to its secrets, and the darkness had only just begun to reveal itself. The tension in the air was suffocating. The girl's legs felt as if they were made of lead, but she couldn't move. Frozen on the staircase, she stared into the cold, empty eyes of the man who had no place in the world of the living. He was close now, just a few steps away, his figure clearer than ever before. The dim glow of her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across his gaunt face. His suit was the same as it had been in the old photographs, crisp, formal, and unmistakably the same one in which he had been buried. But this wasn't just her grandfather. Something about the way he moved, the blankness in his expression, told her that what she was seeing was not simply a loved one returning from the grave. As the figure descended the final step, the air grew colder, the kind of biting chill that sank deep into her bones. The shadows around him seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and contorting as if alive. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. Time seemed to slow as the man reached the base of the stairs. And then, for the first time, he looked directly at her. His eyes, once lifeless and hollow, now glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. It was as though he was no longer the man her mother had loved, no longer her grandfather. He was something far more sinister. A wave of terror crashed over her as his lips parted, not to speak, but to reveal a darkness, an emptiness that seemed to go on forever. It was a void, a black abyss that threatened to consume her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't her grandfather at all. It was a shadow, a malevolent force that had taken on his form, using his image to draw her in. The familiar face was nothing more than a mask, hiding the true horror that lurked beneath. She had been deceived. In that moment, fragments of the past began to flood her mind. Stories she had overheard as a child, whispered in hushed tones by her parents when they thought she wasn't listening. Stories about how her grandfather had died suddenly under mysterious circumstances, and how some believed that his spirit had never truly left the house. But those were just ghost stories, right? Tales told to scare children. Except now, standing face to face with the figure before her, she realized those stories held more truth than she had ever imagined. The house itself seemed to groan under the weight of the revelation, as if it, too, was alive with the knowledge of what had transpired all those years ago. The walls creaked and moaned, and the air grew thicker, almost suffocating, as if the house was closing in on her. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to escape whatever dark force had latched onto her family, whatever it was that had taken the form of her grandfather, and now sought to claim her as well. But before she could move, the figure stepped closer, its gaze still locked on hers. His presence was suffocating, overwhelming, as though the very air around him was heavy with death. The closer he came, the more she felt the pull of the void in his eyes, a darkness that called out to her, beckoning her to fall into its depths. It was as if he was trying to drag her into that cold, empty place where he had been trapped for so long. And in that moment, the truth hit her like a cold, hard slap. This wasn't just a haunting. It was something much worse. The man, the thing, had been bound to the house ever since his death. But now it wanted out. It needed to be free. And the only way it could break free of its prison was to take someone else in its place. The girl realized with a sinking dread that it had chosen her. She was the key to its release, the sacrifice that would allow it to escape the house that had kept it trapped for so many years. Her grandfather's face, the one she had seen in the old photographs, was now twisted into something grotesque, something not human. She had to act, and she had to do it now. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, the girl backed away, her hand gripping the flashlight so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But the figure followed, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. There was no escape, at least not through the front door. She had to think of something else. The attic. She remembered hearing her parents talk about a small, forgotten attic space, sealed off after her grandfather's death. It was the only place in the house where no one ever went, the only place that might hold the key to stopping whatever this thing was. She bolted up the stairs, her heart racing as the darkness behind her seemed to grow heavier, denser, with every passing second. The figure's footsteps echoed behind her, slow but steady, always just a few steps away. Reaching the top of the stairs, she pulled down the attic ladder, the old wood creaking as she climbed into the dusty, forgotten space. She fumbled in the dark, searching for something, anything, that could help her. And then she saw it, a small, old chest in the corner, covered in cobwebs. It was her only chance. The chest was locked, but the key was nearby, hidden under a loose floorboard, just as her parents had said. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the chest, and inside, she found a small, tarnished object, a locket. Her grandfather's locket. The moment she touched it, the air in the attic changed. The oppressive weight lifted, and the footsteps behind her stopped. The figure had vanished, as if banished by the presence of the locket. The girl collapsed to the floor, clutching the locket in her trembling hands. She had survived, but the horror of what had just transpired would stay with her forever. The house was quiet again, but it was a silence that carried a new kind of fear, one that whispered of the darkness that still lingered in the shadows, waiting for another chance to return. The house had fallen silent once more, but it was not a silence of peace. It was the stillness of a place that had seen too much, a house that held secrets within its walls, secrets that should have never been unearthed. The girl, clutching the tarnished locket, sat trembling in the attic, her mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. The figure, her supposed grandfather, was gone, vanished into the void from which it had come, but she knew the terror was far from over. The house had claimed him once, and now it had tried to claim her too. As she descended the stairs, every step felt like she was walking through a nightmare, her legs weak and her body heavy with exhaustion. The house had shifted. It felt different now, more sinister, as though it were watching her, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The air was thick with an unshakable sense of dread, and every shadow seemed to hold a lurking menace. She could no longer look at the staircase the same way. It was no longer just a path between floors. It was a gateway, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had thinned to a terrifying degree. Her mother found her sitting at the base of the stairs, the locket still clutched tightly in her hand, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. The girl tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could she describe the unimaginable? How could she make her mother believe that the figure she had seen wasn't just a ghost, but something darker, something more malicious? Her mother listened quietly, her face tight with worry, but there was no comforting explanation she could offer, no rational answer that could undo the terror her daughter had faced. The days that followed were filled with an eerie quiet, as if the house itself was resting, satisfied with the fear it had inflicted. The girl tried to return to normal life, but every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind against the windows, sent her heart racing. The figure's lifeless eyes haunted her every thought, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting for the right moment to strike again. The locket she had found became her constant companion, a fragile talisman against the darkness that she knew still lurked in the shadows. But the house had left its mark. The girl was no longer the same. She could feel the weight of the supernatural pressing down on her, a presence that followed her wherever she went, even outside the house. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the faintest hint of footsteps on the stairs. And sometimes in the dead of night, she thought she could hear them, those slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the halls, as if the figure was still there, walking the same path it had taken in life. One evening, her mother tried to comfort her, suggesting they move away, leave the house behind, and start fresh somewhere else. But the girl knew it wouldn't help. The presence wasn't just tied to the house. It had latched onto her, a dark shadow that had followed her from that fateful encounter. Wherever she went, she would always carry it with her. The house, the locket, the figure, they were all part of her now, threads woven into the fabric of her life, impossible to escape. The girl tried to resume her daily routine, but every time she walked by the staircase, she couldn't help but glance down into the darkness below, half expecting to see the figure again. She avoided the bathroom with the window that overlooked the stairs, unable to shake the image of her grandfather, or whatever that thing had been, ascending the steps in that slow, deliberate manner. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a prison of fear. She knew that no matter how much time passed, she would never truly feel safe again. As the weeks turned into months, the girl became more withdrawn, more isolated. The experience had changed her in ways she couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just the fear that lingered. It was the knowledge that there were things in the world that defied explanation, forces that could reach out from beyond the grave and twist reality into a waking nightmare. The figure had disappeared, but its presence still haunted her, a constant reminder that the veil between life and death was far thinner than anyone wanted to believe. And then, one night, just as she was beginning to think that the worst was behind her, she heard it again, the unmistakable creak of a footstep on the stairs. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of terror through her body. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen. Another step, and then another, the same slow, deliberate pace as before. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the truth. The figure had never left. It had just been waiting. She gripped the locket tightly, the cold metal biting into her palm, but it no longer felt like a protection. It felt like a tether, binding her to the spirit of her grandfather, or whatever dark force had taken his place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside her door. The house fell silent once more, but the girl knew this was not the end. The terror was far from over. The house had claimed her, and it would never let her go. In the darkness, she could almost see him standing there, just beyond the door, waiting for her to take that final step into his world. And she realized, with a sinking dread, that one day she would. The terror would never leave. It would follow her for the rest of her life, lurking just out of sight, always waiting for its chance to return. The girl would forever be marked, a prisoner of the supernatural forces that had found her in that old, creaking house. The nightmare had only just begun. As the days turned into years, the house remained, looming on the edge of the girl's memories like a dark, unwelcome presence that refused to be forgotten. She had left the house behind, moving far away in hopes of escaping the nightmares that clung to her like a second skin. But no matter how far she went, the experience followed her, always just behind her, like a shadow she could never outrun. It was as if the house, or perhaps something far more malevolent, had imprinted itself on her soul, leaving a scar that time could not heal. The locket she had found that night in the attic never left her side. She kept it hidden, locked away in a drawer, but she could never bring herself to get rid of it. It was more than just a relic of her family's past. It was a reminder of what she had seen, what she had experienced. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, she would take it out, feeling the cold metal against her skin, and wonder if it still held some connection to the darkness that had haunted her. Was it simply a keepsake, or was it something more sinister, a link to whatever had taken the form of her grandfather that night? She tried to move on with her life, but there were always small reminders, subtle hints that the nightmare wasn't truly over. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, just a shadow passing by too quickly to be real, but enough to send a chill down her spine. Other times, she would hear faint creaks in her apartment, like footsteps on old wooden floors, even though her new home was entirely modern. These moments were fleeting, but they left her with a deep sense of unease, as if the thing she had encountered in the house was still watching her from afar, waiting for the right moment to return. One night, while lying in bed, she had a dream, or at least she thought it was a dream. In the dream, she was back in the house, standing at the top of the staircase, looking down into the darkness below. The air was thick and cold, just like it had been on that terrifying night. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the familiar sensation of being watched. And then, slowly, the figure began to ascend the stairs again. The same man, the same suit, the same hollow eyes staring straight ahead. But this time, he was closer, much closer. The fear was paralyzing, but in the dream, she couldn't move, couldn't scream. All she could do was watch as he climbed the stairs, one step at a time, until he was standing right in front of her. When she woke, drenched in sweat, the fear didn't leave her. It clung to her like a fog, thick and oppressive. The dream had felt so real, too real, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just her mind playing tricks on her. It was as if the figure had found her again, reaching out from the past, trying to pull her back into the darkness she had so desperately tried to escape. The locket, now lying on her nightstand, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if it, too, held the remnants of the dream. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and for the first time in years, she opened it. Inside was a photograph of her grandfather, the same one she had seen in the album all those years ago. But something was different now. His eyes, once soft and kind in the old family photos, seemed to stare back at her with a cold, lifeless intensity. She quickly shut the locket, her heart racing. The connection between the past and the present had never felt stronger. It was as if the dream had awakened something, a force that had been dormant but never truly gone. In the days that followed, the girl, now grown, began to wonder if the house had truly let her go. Had it allowed her to leave, or had it marked her, tying her fate to its dark, twisted history forever? The footsteps on the stairs, the shadowy figure, the locket, they were all pieces of a puzzle she would never fully understand. But one thing was clear. The terror she had experienced as a child was not just a moment in time. It was a part of her now, an inescapable force that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She tried to return to normalcy, but the fear lingered. Every time she walked down a dark hallway, every time she caught her reflection in a mirror, she felt the presence of the house, as if it was still watching her, still waiting for her to return. The memories of that night, once sharp and terrifying, had faded over time, but the feeling, that gut-wrenching sense of dread, had never left. It stayed with her, lurking in the back of her mind, a constant reminder that some nightmares never truly end. She began to avoid stairs altogether, preferring to take elevators even when they made her uneasy. Every creak of wood, every flicker of light, made her heart race, reminding her of that night in the house. The rational part of her tried to dismiss it as trauma, a lingering fear from a childhood experience. But deep down, she knew better. The house, the figure, the locket, it was all connected to something far darker than she could explain. Something that didn't play by the rules of a living world. And so, she continued to live with the fear, with the knowledge that the thing she had encountered was still out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to pull her back into its grasp. The house might be miles away, but the terror it had instilled in her had followed her, always lurking just beneath the surface. The locket, now hidden away once more, was a constant reminder of that connection, a physical link to the past she could never sever. As she sat alone in the quiet of her apartment, the shadows began to stretch longer, the air colder. She glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. And then, in the silence of the night, she heard it. The faint, unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slowly, deliberately, they grew louder, closer. She didn't need to look to know what was coming. The house, the figure, the nightmare. It had found her again,